Stand on a ridge above Hiniwai Reserve in New Zealand, and the scene looks impossible. Native forest folds into gullies, kanuka crowns move in the wind, bellbirds call from trees that nobody planted. Yet beneath this canopy lies the dead skeleton of one of New Zealand's most hated weeds. In 1987, botanist Hugh Wilson was told that leaving the gorse alive was reckless. But Wilson believed the weed was building the nursery for its own replacement. What grew through those thorns would change a landscape and challenge the way people think damaged land should be repaired. Walk into the young forest and the old battlefield is still visible. Gray gorse stems lie twisted under maho and wineberry. Some are as thick as a wrist. Their branches still carry the hard points that once made these hills nearly impassable. But the plants themselves are finished. Above them, leaves catch the sun that the gorse can no longer reach. Ferns spread across the shaded ground. A po-waka waka flicks between trunks, searching for insects. Water moves through a gully that was once exposed pasture. That is the result. The strange part is how it happened. Hugh Wilson did not arrive with an army of tree planters. He did not cover the reserve with plastic guards, irrigation pipes, and rows of nursery saplings. He inherited a rough piece of hill country covered with pasture, scattered native remnants, broom, and enormous areas of prickly European gorse. Previous owners had fought that gorse for years. Wilson looked at the same yellow thickets and saw a stage in a longer process. His decision sounded outrageous because gorse was not a harmless wildflower. It was a serious agricultural weed. It invaded pasture, blocked access, sheltered pests, and could turn steep hillsides into a dense wall of fuel. Generations of farmers had spent money and exhausting labor trying to destroy it. When Wilson proposed leaving much of it standing, he was not questioning a minor gardening habit. He was challenging one of rural New Zealand's most deeply learned instincts. The argument became personal. After the new reserve explained its approach in a local newspaper, a critic dismissed the conservationists as naive greenies and ended with a phrase that stayed with the project for decades: "Heaven help us from fools and dreamers." At the time, the critic had a point worth taking seriously. If Wilson was wrong, Hiniwai would become a reservoir of weed seeds beside working farms. Fire could send flames through the scrub. The gorse could spread along boundaries, swallowing land that other people depended on. A romantic experiment on private reserve land could create very real costs for everyone nearby. Wilson understood that. He also knew something the argument missed. Gorse does not behave the same way in every landscape. In a farm system built to preserve open grass, gorse is a relentless enemy. In a landscape moving toward closed forest, its greatest strength contains a fatal weakness. But this story does not begin with the weed. It begins with a forest that disappeared. Banks Peninsula reaches into the Pacific from the east coast of New Zealand's South Island. Its ridges and bays are the eroded remains of ancient volcanoes. For much of its history, forest ran across this broken terrain, from sheltered valleys toward high summits and down to the coast. Birds moved seed between catchments. Rain struck leaves instead of bare pasture. Roots held steep soil together. Human settlement changed that cover in two broad waves. Polynesian settlers began clearing and modifying parts of the peninsula centuries ago. European settlement from the middle of the 19th century brought far more extensive felling and burning for timber and pasture. By 1900, less than 1% of the peninsula's original forest cover remained. The loss was severe, but it was not complete. Native vegetation survived in places that axes, fire, and livestock found difficult to reach. Small stands clung to damp gullies. Plants held on beneath bluffs, in rocky hollows, and on steep slopes. Those fragments looked insignificant against a largely cleared peninsula. Ecologically, they were seed vaults waiting in the open air. Wilson knew those fragments unusually well. Long before Hiniwai, he had spent years studying New Zealand plants in the field. He surveyed the Aoraki Mount Cook region, followed by Rakiura Stewart Island. In the 1980s, he turned his attention to Banks Peninsula, crossing farms and ridges to record vegetation plot by plot. This was not a man guessing from the view beside a road. He had seen where the old species survived, which slopes stayed moist, and where natural regeneration was already pushing against grazing and clearance. The survey revealed a landscape that was wounded but still active. Kanuka kept trying to colonize pasture. Native shrubs appeared where animals could not reach them. Birds still traveled between remnants. Forest was not absent as an ecological possibility. It was being held back. Wilson began imagining a reserve where those restraints could be lifted. He wanted a piece of land where nature could reassert herself, as he later described it. The idea was larger than protecting a surviving patch. Protection would freeze the map where it was. Wilson wanted to watch the map change. The practical obstacle was money. A botanist with a dream does not automatically become a landowner. Then Wilson met Maurice White, a retired accountant who had created a trust to purchase land for conservation. White was willing to finance a proposal that many people considered speculative. In September 1987, the Maurice White Native Forest Trust bought the first 109 hectares that became Hinawai Reserve. The block was cheap for a reason. It was steep, difficult to farm, and much of it was buried under old gorse. A succession of owners had temporarily cleared areas, established pasture, and run sheep, cattle, and pigs, but the gorse kept returning. Maintaining grass required a constant fight, and the hill country made every part of that fight harder. Wilson became the manager of a reserve that did not yet resemble the forest in his mind. About 42% of the first block held native forest and scrub in various stages. Much of the rest was pasture, broom, young scrub, or dense mature gorse. The land contained both the survivors and the damage, side by side. The obvious conservation response would have been to clear the exotic plants, then replant natives. That approach can work, and in many places it is exactly what restoration requires. Wilson chose a different path because the gorse was already performing several expensive jobs for free. To understand that gamble, look closely at the plant itself. Gorse, or Ulex europaeus, is a spiny member of the legume family. European settlers brought it to New Zealand before 1835, mainly for hedges and agricultural use. In its new environment, it escaped, spread, and formed thickets across lowlands and hill country. By 1900, Parliament had declared it a noxious weed. Its yellow flowers can make an infested hillside look beautiful from a distance. Up close, the beauty has teeth. The branches interlock. The spines tear clothing and skin. Mature plants can block people and livestock, while their seeds accumulate in the soil and remain viable for decades. That seed bank turns ordinary control into a long war. Cut down a thicket and sunlight hits the ground. Burn it and heat, ash, and open space create a fresh opportunity. Spray the adult plants and buried seeds remain. A cleared site may look conquered for a season, only to erupt with thousands of seedlings. The disturbance removes the old canopy, but it also restores the bright conditions young gorse needs. Wilson's proposal was almost perversely simple. Stop repeatedly resetting the battlefield. Leave established gorse where it was useful. Remove the sheep, cattle, goats, and other browsers that ate native seedlings. Prevent fire. Protect nearby seed sources. Then wait for the gorse to age. For roughly its first decade in Hinawai's climate, gorse grows quickly and competes aggressively in full sunlight. Over time, however, its upward growth slows. The dense canopy begins to loosen. Old stems lean, split, and collapse. Small gaps appear. The thicket that once excluded almost everything starts changing from a fortress into a roof with holes. Under that roof, conditions are different from open pasture. The gorse cuts the wind. Its litter covers the soil. Shade reduces temperature extremes and slows the loss of moisture. Because gorse is a legume associated with nitrogen-fixing bacteria, it can also contribute to a richer soil environment. Just as important, its spines create physical protection around anything small enough to begin beneath it. That matters because many native forest plants are poorly equipped to start life in exposed grass. A seedling in open pasture faces drying wind, harsh sun, competition from dense grasses, and hungry animals. Beneath aging gorse, the same seedling may find damp litter, filtered light, and a cage of thorns that browsing mouths cannot easily enter. The arrangement works because the two generations want different things. Gorse is hungry for light. It cannot establish a healthy new generation beneath its own shade. Many native broadleaf species tolerate shade when young. They can wait below, then accelerate when a gap opens. Birds complete the system. Carreru, bellbirds, silver eyes, and introduced fruit-eating birds move through the landscape. They feed in surviving bush and carry seeds elsewhere, often depositing them with a small packet of fertilizer. Wind carries other seeds. Gravity and water shift still more downhill. A gorse thicket may look sealed from the outside, but seed is arriving through the air, in droppings, and along the ground. Wilson believed people routinely underestimated that natural movement. Hiniwai had an advantage because remnants of native forest remained nearby. Every mature shrub on a bluff and every fruiting tree in a gully could supply the next stand. The reserve did not need to invent a forest species by species. It needed to reconnect the ecological processes that already knew how to move one. The first recruits were not the giant trees of a finished old-growth forest. Succession works through stages. Maho appeared. So did poraporo, wineberry, native fuchsia, lemonwood, five-finger, and other broad-leaved plants. Their seedlings grew beneath the gorse, found openings, and pushed upward. Kanuka followed a different race. When Kanuka and gorse began growing together, both demanded strong light and both rose quickly. For a few years, the contest could look even, but gorse often slowed after reaching a few meters, while Kanuka kept climbing. If a young Kanuka held its crown above the thorns during those early years, it could eventually reach twice the gorse's height. Then the balance flipped. Native leaves spread over the gorse. Light at the thorny canopy fell. The plant that had smothered pasture could not survive being smothered itself. Its green branches grayed, its stems died, and its body became litter beneath the young forest. I mean, think about that for a second. The weed was not pulled out. It was overtaken by the living system it had sheltered. This process did not require gorse to become native, harmless, or desirable everywhere. It simply placed the plant inside a succession that had an ending. The reserve's goal was no longer pasture, so gorse could lose the open conditions that made it dominant. Change the destination of the land, and the same plant can play a very different role on the way there. The phrase used at Hiniwai was minimal interference. That phrase is easy to misunderstand. It can sound like Wilson locked the gate, made tea, and waited for a forest. The reality involved years of targeted, sometimes exhausting work. Stock grazing had to stop. Fences needed constant maintenance because one group of sheep wandering through a regenerating area could erase months of seedling growth. Goats had to be removed, a task Wilson once doubted the team could complete. Possums required ongoing control. Deer later emerged as a new browsing threat. Tracks had to be opened, checked, and kept safe for visitors. The team did not tolerate every exotic organism. Sycamore, radiata pine, old man's beard, and other highly competitive plants could block the desired succession rather than prepare it, so they were targeted. The rule was ecological, not ideological. Remove the forces that seriously prevented native recovery. Leave temporary cover when it helped that recovery. Intervene where the next stage could not arrive by itself. Gorse also had to be controlled around boundaries and walking tracks. Its main natural seed dispersal happens when hot, dry pods burst and throw seeds a short distance. Hiniwai kept cleared strips inside boundary fences and planted fast-growing native species there. That work reduced the risk of adding seed to neighboring farms and showed that the reserve understood its obligations beyond its own fence. Fire prevention was even more important. Gorse and young Kanuka both burn readily. Fire opens the canopy and favors the deep gorse seed bank. A single blaze can send succession backward by years or decades, depending on the age of the vegetation that burns. Hiniwai therefore imposed a year-round ban on smoking, cookers, and open flames. Wilson was not merely watching, he was testing a prediction. He expected the wettest gullies to change first. Moisture would help seedlings establish, and nearby remnants would provide abundant seed. Exposed ridges would be slower because wind, sun, and drier soil would make every stage more difficult. Some gorse might be suppressed within a decade. Other stands could take 3 times as long. In a scientific paper published in the early 1990s, Wilson described Hiniwai as a mosaic. About 4% of the wider area in his study remained old-growth forest. Roughly 30% was closed canopy second-growth native forest. More than half was gorse and broom scrub, with the rest in pasture, fernland, and tussock. If fire could be excluded, he predicted that native second-growth forest would eventually dominate about 95% of the reserve. That forecast was daring because ecological succession is full of surprises. A diagram can show one plant community leading neatly into another. Real slopes have droughts, storms, animal incursions, seed shortages, landslides, and chance. One ridge can remain stuck while a gully only a few hundred meters away changes rapidly. Wilson's model had to survive contact with an unruly landscape. The first visible proof was easy to miss. There was no day when the weed vanished and a forest switched on. A seedling appeared under a gap, then dozens more. A young mahoe reached the lower gorse branches. Kanuka tips began showing above a yellow canopy. Native foliage covered one small patch, then another. A pair of photographs later preserved by New Zealand's Te Ara Encyclopedia captured that quiet transition. In the first image, the ground beneath 15-year-old gorse was covered in litter soon after browsing animals were removed. There were no visible seedlings. 3 years later, the same site held many young mahoe and poroporo plants. 3 years. The seed had arrived, the browsers were gone, and the nursery had begun working. As those patches expanded, the argument changed. Visitors could step from sunlight and thorns into cool native shade. They could see dead gorse below living crowns. The evidence was no longer a theory in a botanical journal. It was standing overhead. Hiniwai also began to grow. In 1991, the Trust acquired neighboring Otanerito Station, expanding the project from a small reserve toward a whole catchment. Further additions followed. The official Hiniwai Reserve now occupies about 1,250 hectares, and the team has also cared for adjacent conservation land. The scale mattered. Small forest fragments can be extraordinarily valuable, but a connected catchment allows ecological processes to move. Birds can travel through continuous cover. Seeds can spread along slopes. Streams can run from higher country through forest toward the coast. Species living at different elevations gain space to shift as conditions change. By 2024, reporting on the wider land under the team's care described more than 1,600 hectares and a recent addition reaching the sea. A dream that began with one difficult block had become a living corridor from high ground toward the coast. The Fool's Map was becoming real. If this story is giving you a different way to see damaged land, subscribe. We explore ecological recoveries, strange conservation ideas, and the people patient enough to prove them. The greatest payoff was not the disappearance of gorse, it was everything that could happen after the first native canopy closed. Early scrub is only the beginning of a forest. Kanuka and fast-growing broad-leaved trees create another nursery, this time for species that prefer deeper shade and more stable conditions. Totara, mata-erer, and other podocarps can establish within developing forest. Red beech can rise through suitable Kanuka stands. Tree ferns occupy damp places. Fungi connect roots to soil. Fallen wood stores water and feeds insects. The structure becomes more complex. A thicket has one main ceiling. A forest develops layers. Tall crowns intercept wind. Smaller trees fill the middle. Shrubs, ferns, mosses, seedlings, and decomposers work near the ground. Dead material is not cleared away as waste. It becomes habitat and soil. Hiniwai now records about 330 native vascular plant species. More than 60 fern species grow there, including 6 kinds of tree fern. Bellbirds, tua, kareru, tomtits, gray warblers, fantails, riflemen, shining cuckoos, kingfishers, and other birds can be heard or seen across the reserve. Some of those birds do more than decorate the finished forest. They help build its next stage. A fruit eaten in one valley may become a seedling in another. As forest cover increases, the habitat supports more movement, which carries more seed, which helps more forest establish. Recovery begins feeding itself. That loop also reveals why Wilson's method cannot be reduced to one miraculous plant. Gorse created shelter, but surviving native forest supplied seed. Birds provided transport. Pest control protected seedlings. Fences excluded livestock. Rainfall and topography created favorable microsites. Time allowed slow-growing trees to catch fast-growing scrub, remove enough pieces, and the loop breaks. A gorse stand far from native seed sources may remain gorse much longer. A hillside full of deer or goats can receive thousands of seeds without producing a forest. A dry, exposed site may never give shade-tolerant seedlings the moisture they need. Repeated fire can keep returning the landscape to the same thorny starting point. And in July 2011, fire came to Hiniwai. A major blaze, believed to have been started by lightning, moved through part of the reserve. The flames attacked the central condition on which Wilson's prediction depended. Young scrub burned. Native regeneration that had taken years to rise was damaged. Light returned to the soil, and the buried gorse seed bank was ready. Wilson had described the danger decades earlier. Fire through young gorse could delay succession for a few years. Fire through old gorse could cost 10 or 15 years. If maturing Kanuka burned, the setback could stretch across decades. If ancient beech or podocarp forest was lost, centuries of development could disappear in a single event. The fire exposed the uncomfortable side of using gorse. A nurse canopy can also be fuel. The early stages of natural regeneration may carry greater fire risk before broad-leaved forest creates a cooler and less flammable environment. Climate change, hotter dry periods, and human ignition make that transition increasingly dangerous in many landscapes. For a moment, Hiniwai's greatest critic seemed to be the land itself. If fire kept returning, the gorse could keep winning. Every burn would reopen the canopy, stimulate more seed, and reset the shade clock. But the fire did not erase the whole system. Native seed sources survived. The reserve remained protected from stock. Pest control continued. Gorse germinated rapidly in burned ground, but that new thicket could again become shelter if fire stayed away long enough. The sequence had been pushed backward, not destroyed. The recovery after the blaze was slower than a triumphant before and after montage suggests. Some places had to repeat years of succession. Yet the returning vegetation demonstrated another quality of the project. Its future did not depend on a single planting season or one generation of nursery trees. It depended on processes that could restart. As native broad-leaved forest matures, fire behavior can change. Wilson observed that second-growth forest dominated by mayho, fuchsia, five-finger, and similar plants was less flammable than gorse and young Kanuka. Red beech was also relatively resistant, while totara could sometimes resprout from charred trunks. The safest landscape was therefore not permanent gorse. It was the forest beyond gorse. That detail is easy to lose in the inspirational version of this story. Hiniwai is not proof that invasive plants should be celebrated or left everywhere. It is proof that management should be based on ecological function, site conditions, and the direction of succession. Research outside Hiniwai makes the warning clearer. A study published by the New Zealand Ecological Society compared native forest succession through gorse with succession through Kanuka near Wellington and Nelson. Gorse often did lead toward native broad-leaved forest over several decades, but the resulting communities were not identical. Plant richness was often lower in gorse sites. Small-leaved shrubs and orchids were less common. Differences remained even in older stands, suggesting that a forest developing through gorse does not automatically converge with one developing through native Kanuka. The exotic nursery can help produce a forest, but it does not perfectly reproduce every pathway the original ecosystem might have taken. A recent literature review, prepared for New Zealand's Ministry for Primary Industries, reached a similarly careful conclusion. Hiniwai demonstrates real success with gorse and broom under minimal interference management, yet the approach should be used cautiously. Favorable climate, nearby seed, removal of grazing animals, and control of other threats matter. In some settings, native pioneer plants will support a richer and more appropriate succession. That distinction matters because Hinawai can be misused as an excuse. A landowner could point to Wilson's forest and claim any neglected gorse patch is restoration. It is not. If the site remains exposed to fire, lacks native seed, shelters uncontrolled browsers, or threatens neighboring land, doing nothing may simply preserve a dangerous weed problem. Wilson did not plant gorse to restore Hinawai. It was already there in overwhelming abundance. His insight was to stop spending resources on wholesale removal, where the existing scrub could be recruited into a native recovery process. That is a very different decision from spreading gorse into an uninfested landscape. The lesson also changes with the goal. On productive pasture, the objective is to maintain open grass, so gorse control remains essential. Near a rare native grassland or another open ecosystem, allowing woody scrub to take over could destroy the habitat conservation is meant to protect. Forest is not the correct destination for every piece of land. Hinawai worked on land that had once been forest, where remnant forests survived, and where the reserve explicitly aimed to restore native woody cover. Even there, the team managed boundaries, fire, animals, and invasive competitors. Context did not weaken the experiment. It explained it. This is where the story becomes useful far beyond one New Zealand peninsula. Around the world, ecological restoration is often pictured as planting. Volunteers stand in rows, each holding a seedling. Aerial footage shows neat grids of young trees. The images are easy to understand because human effort is visible. Someone puts a tree into the ground, therefore a forest begins. Planting can be vital. It may be the only way to return missing species, bridge large seed gaps, or establish vegetation on severely altered soil. But planting is expensive, labor-intensive, and difficult to scale across every degraded hillside. Seedlings can die when the shelter, fungi, moisture, or animal control they need are missing. Natural regeneration asks a different opening question. What is already trying to grow here, and what keeps killing it? At Hinawai, the barriers included grazing stock, goats, possums, repeated clearance, fire, and a few highly competitive plants. Once those pressures were reduced, millions of seeds and seedlings performed the planting. The budget shifted from manufacturing every tree to protecting a process. That can create enormous savings, but cheap does not mean free. Land still has to be secured. Fences, pest control, fire prevention, scientific monitoring, boundary work, tracks, and staff all cost money. Decades of patience require an institution that will keep going after the excitement of the first planting day has passed. Hinawai's trust provided that continuity. Its small team maintained the reserve while opening it freely to walkers. An old wool shed became an information center. Wilson continued documenting changes, writing and illustrating the PPPP newsletter by hand. Visitors could see different stages of succession within a single walk, from yellow gorse to young Kanuka and deeper native forest. The project also entered the modern carbon economy. Regenerating forest stores atmospheric carbon, and income from carbon credits helped the trust acquire more land. Wilson has spoken openly about the ethical tension in offsets. A forest should not become permission for a business to keep emitting forever. The trust says it vets buyers and sells to organizations committed to reaching carbon zero. Carbon is only one part of the return. Forest also stabilizes steep slopes, shades streams, slows runoff, creates habitat, and reconnects fragments. It gives seed-dispersing birds more places to live. It turns a landscape managed for one output into a system capable of many forms of life. The recovery is still unfinished. A 30-year-old native canopy is young beside a mature podocarp or beech forest. Some trees that may dominate Hinawai's future will outlive everyone who remembers the reserve's beginning. Ecological restoration on this scale asks people to work for an outcome they will never fully see. Wilson appears unusually comfortable with that bargain. His career was built on patient observation. He watched plants over years, drew them in detail, and learned landscapes by walking and cycling through them. The method at Hinawai reflects that temperament. Pay attention long enough to distinguish a permanent obstacle from a temporary stage. The criticism that once surrounded the reserve has faded because the hills now answer it. There are more natives than gorse. The thorny canopy is retreating wherever taller forest has closed above it. The reserve that began with 109 hectares has become a large connected refuge. And land once dismissed as marginal now carries birdsong, walking tracks, streams, carbon, and young forest. Still, calling the result unbelievable can hide the most important fact. Nothing supernatural happened. Seeds moved. Animals were controlled. Plants competed for light. Shade changed the winter. The unbelievable part was that Wilson trusted these ordinary processes when the landscape looked hopeless, and public opinion told him to attack what he saw. That trust was not blind. It was measured against plots, species, slopes, weather, and decades. When the evidence demanded intervention, the team intervened. When succession could do the work, they made room for it. Hinawai became an experiment in knowing the difference. Return to that ridge now. Below, the forest is not uniform. Some slopes still carry gorse. Other patches are covered in Kanuka. Damp gullies hold broad-leaved trees and ferns. Older remnants contain the species that survived the Great Clearance. The whole reserve is a time sequence spread across space. In one view, you can see the past, the transition, and a possible future. Open grass recalls the farm. Yellow scrub marks the nursery. Young native canopy shows the takeover. Taller forest hints at what may stand there a century from now. The gorse did not become the hero of Hinawai. It remained thorny, invasive, and dangerous beside farms and fire. Hugh Wilson did something more interesting than declaring an enemy good. He found the one weakness that allowed a damaged ecosystem to use that enemy, then leave it behind. Under the forest, the dead thorns are slowly becoming soil. Above them, native leaves hold the light. If you want to see another landscape where the obvious solution failed and nature found a stranger path back, click the documentary on screen.